So looking at the Second Civil War, Charles was still in a strong position to negotiate after the First Civil War, despite his defeat, because at the end of the day, he is still the monarchy. He has not been removed and he has not been placed on trial, though he still adopted old habits. So he still tried to manipulate the circumstances in his favour, and any proposition put forward to him by Parliament were kind of swiftly rejected, even though he was under house arrest in Hampton Court. So by 1646, there were two parliamentary factions which were labelled the Political Presbyterians and Political Independents. Now, they're both branches of Protestantism, however, their methods in which they want to go about negotiating with Charles is completely different. So the Political Presbyterians presented their settlements to Charles, and these were known as the Newcastle Propositions. Now, this was proposed to Charles, and Charles is quite clever in how he deals with that proposition. Now, under the proposition by the Presbyterians, Charles had to accept the establishment of Presbyterianism in England for 3 years, bearing in mind that obviously for the last 11 years under the personal rule, we've had a Laudianistic country, so Laudianism as a religion, which swayed towards Catholicism according to Protestants. Parliament was to control the militia for 20 years, not the Crown, possibly as a method to prevent Charles from being militant again. And the Triennial Act was also to remain, which restricted the power of the monarchy. However, Charles halted a confirmation or rejection of the propositions, meaning that the Presbyterians, instead of holding out on their offer, actually presented a counter offer of dismantling sections of the New Model Army. Now, although they were able to pay the army during the Civil War, they were not able to pay them the full rate, and as a result of that, they were in £3 million in debt to the army because of the war. And this then led to the New Model Army becoming very politicised. So the New Model Army is no longer just militant, it's also becoming much more political. They feel they're being ousted by the Presbyterians by saying that they will be dismantled as a unit, but also the fact that they are owed arrears in payments by the Parliament. So the political independents, which are members of the New Model Army and the allies to the New Model Army, opposed the propositions and were angered by the arrears and no guarantee of pardon from Parliament for their actions in the war. They're particularly angered by this because although they're not remorseful for their actions, the factor is that if the Presbyterians negotiated with Charles and created a peace deal whereby the monarchy still had power and influence, they could charge members of the New Model Army and particularly the commanders of the New Model Army with treason and have them executed. And Parliament at this point had not offered any kind of offer of protection or pardon for their actions in the war. So the New Model Army presented their own demands, known as the heads of the proposals, and this was directly proposed to Charles. So Charles has two propositions, and he's very aware of the faction within Parliament at this time, and their proposition or their proposal is to regularly hold parliaments, which is a very democratic request, but would have been quite deemed to be radical by Charles at this moment in time, and reform to representation. So it's not just the gentry and the nobility who get to represent the electorate, it's also members of the army. They also want parliamentary control of the army and navy, and the Act of Oblivion was quite significant for them because they again wanted some guarantee of being pardoned should the monarchy be reinstated in any way, shape or form. However, Charles escaped Hampton Court, so he escaped house arrest and began to negotiate with some of the Scots who were dissatisfied with their alliance with English Parliament, and this was known as the Engagement of 1647, whereby Charles agreed to 3 years of Presbyterianism in return for Scottish support in invading England and restoring his power as monarch. Don't forget there is this ongoing distrust between the English Parliament and Charles, so he's not completely swayed by the proposal that he's been represented with so far. And the threat of the Scottish invasion meant that Parliament passed the vote of no addresses in 1648, and this formally ends negotiations with Charles. So the New Model Army, basically in anticipation of meeting the new Scottish threat, There's no guarantee at this time that they would be victorious because they're now fighting their former allies. They basically meet at Windsor Prayer to have a meeting in 1648, and for the first time they're openly discussing regicide. So bearing in mind the lead up to and during World War One and after the First Civil War, not World War One, after the First Civil War, during and before, Parliament have never discussed the idea of dismantling the monarchy. They have never discussed executing the monarchy because that would be treason to do so. They have never discussed the idea of Parliament having complete control and the monarchy just being a figurehead. Yes, they've kind of grappled with the idea of reducing the monarchy's influence, but they're not completely eradicating their powers. This is significant because for the first time in 1648, the New Model Army is saying, actually, we could govern without a monarchy, whether that is through execution or exile. And that is kind of radical for this time period. So a series of royalist and anti-parliament Presbyterian risings emerged in several areas within England. So let's have a look. So within England, we have a number of uprisings. So we have uprisings in south of Wales. We have an uprising in Yorkshire, East Anglia, so Essex and Norwich area, and Kent. Now, this is a very effective military model that has been used on many wars, and the aim is to basically filter out your enemy's resources, so to make them thin out and spread them out so that they become much more easily defeated. They don't want to make the same mistake as the First Civil War, whereby the parliamentarians have control of the south and London. They want to spread their army out into different areas. Now, obviously, this would have easily resulted in the New Model Army defeat had they not had effective commanders in charge. So what they effectively do is that they iron out, yes, their New Model Army troops and their resources, but they also send experienced troop commanders off into different areas. So Oliver Cromwell goes to the south of Wales, Ireton and Fairfax go to Kent, and then we have them dealing with those threats there. Likewise, there's another effective leader in the New Model Army at this time called General Lambert, and he goes up to Yorkshire to deal with the northern threats closer to the Scottish border. Now, these are kind of the three triangulated areas that are dealt with first and initially. South Wales is quite prominent and important because there's nothing stopping from an Irish threat from coming over through to Wales and attacking London. So Cromwell deals with the southern Welsh threat before then joining Lambert in Yorkshire, and Ireton and Fairfax deal with the Kent issue before then moving up to East Anglia to deal with the threat in the east. Now this proves to be really effective, and they managed to defeat the Royalists. And the battle at Colchester in 1648 was the last battle between the Royalists and the Parliamentarians, and this resulted in the last of the Royalists being defeated and executed by the army. However, many moderates in Parliament still wished to pursue open negotiations with Charles when he was sent to house arrest again, but this time on the Isle of Wight. And ultimately, this creates a division between Parliament and the army. The New Model Army had discussed regicide before the Second Civil War, and it's now the army who are arguing that it's impossible to create a peace negotiation with the Royalists and with Charles. Parliament, on the other hand, is still full of a handful of moderates, including Fairfax, to be fair, from the New Model Army. He's a fairly moderate man in comparison to the likes of Ireton and Cromwell. So it would be this division between army and Parliament after the Second Civil War that became crucial in leading to the execution of Charles I and the first act of regicide in this period of England.